A leading sustainability educator and environmental expert, Arron Wood is Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne, elected in 2012 and 2016. As Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne, he made significant contributions to dealing with climate change, implementing on-street innovation, and ensuring pedestrian safety. Arron Wood is also the founder of the award-winning education program, Kids Teaching Kids, that has seen over 125,000 students participate in the peer education model since 1999. We meet with Arron Wood, Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne, Australia's fastest-growing city and the second most livable city in the world. Melbourne is one of the world's most livable cities. It's home to more than 5 million people, about 20% of Australia's population. Now, often referred to as Australia's Garden City, Melbourne offers an urban life in harmony with nature. And today joining us, we have Arron Wood, Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne. Welcome to Heart to Heart. Welcome to the studio.
안녕하세요. Thanks for having me.
안녕하세요. 와주셔서 감사합니다, meaning thank you for joining us.
I'm glad to explain that to me. 감사합니다.
So this isn't your first visit to Korea. Tell us about the purpose of this visit and how many times you've been here so far.
So I'm lucky enough to be here on behalf of the Korea Foundation, who do amazing work right across the world, and they've supported my visit here this week. And it's a real mix of, seeing some tourist sites, which is great, but also mixing with people like the Seoul Metropolitan Government. We had a meeting with the Minister of Foreign Affairs as well. So it isn't my first visit to Korea. I absolutely love Korea. I was lucky enough to be invited here to Busan the first couple of times, and then a visit to Seoul a few years after that. So this is my fourth visit to Korea.
Fourth visit. I'm sure every visit felt different. Did it feel different, or has it remained the same?
No, I think it's really different because when I previously visited Korea, I was just in my role with Kids Teaching Kids, which is all about environmental education. So it had a real focus in those first couple of visits around mixing with young people from Busan, finding out about the school system in Korea. And it was my first time to Korea and I had no idea what to expect, whereas with this visit, I at least knew what I was in for, but I'm learning something new every time. And I think this visit in particular with the Korea Foundation, being able to access some quite amazing experiences, including the DMZ and the joint security areas. So learning a lot about security on the Korean Peninsula and some of these other bigger issues as well.
I see. Hope you get the chance to return to Korea in the future, of course. But I'd like to ask you about the ways the urban landscape between Seoul in particular, or other cities you've been to, that would be Busan, how they differ from Melbourne, or are there similarities as well?
Look, I think there are the real similarities between Seoul and Melbourne in that we are struggling with a lot of the same threats, I guess, in things like rapid population growth and how to accommodate that population growth, things like congestion through vehicular traffic, climate change and the sort of impacts that we see there. So there's some of the similarities, but I think what's really different about Seoul and Melbourne is that Melbourne has just ticked over 5 million people, whereas Seoul is double that in over 10 million people, and I think 25 million people in the surrounding areas. So Seoul is definitely a much bigger city, and I think Melbourne has much to learn about when you move from a city of 5 million people. How do people get around the city? What does your subway, your metro system have to look like? How do you still maintain that livability that's so important to your citizens, those green open spaces, but still have such a huge number of people in the city?
Right. Now, as I did briefly mention in the beginning of the program, I did say that Melbourne ranked as the world's most livable cities, or the most livable city. 7 times, that is, from 2011 to 2017. That's 7 consecutive times.
straight in a row. So what does it take a city to become, a livable city? And how was Melbourne able to, I guess, keep that spot, maintain at that spot throughout the years?
Yeah, it's a really good question because that World Livability Index has just come out again. Sadly, we've dropped to number 2. Vienna has taken the crown, but you're exactly right. For 7 years, Melbourne was the world's most livable city. And the index measures things like security and stability, health, education, infrastructure. Those sorts of things like culture and the environment are also measured. So I think what you see is there's 3 Australian cities in the top 10, 3 Canadian cities in the top 10, and we consistently are marked very high on healthcare, on education, on sort of security and stability, and even environment as well. So I think what's enabled us to really stay at that top of the World Livability Index is that investment in education, in healthcare, and in infrastructure. But that's not to say that we can rest on our laurels, because I think livability and sustainability have to be linked. And when you look at where Australia sits in terms of the sustainability indexes, we aren't so high because we still do have quite a reliance on fossil fuel. And my strong belief in livability is that if you don't combine that with sustainability, you'll only be livable for a certain amount of time.
Right. Just gets me curious. You did grow up in Victoria.
I did.
But I'd like to ask you if you could possibly recommend maybe a location, a place, a spot in Melbourne, that's worth checking out.
So I'm a little bit biased in that I think Melbourne and Victoria, as you said, the Garden State. We really are blessed with the foresight of our early planners, who have this beautiful ring of green heritage gardens. And my favourite is Fitzroy Gardens. It's one of our oldest gardens in the city of Melbourne, and you are literally right on the doorstep of all the skyscrapers of the city. You can see them above the trees. But it's this oasis where you can just sit and contemplate and be amongst this beautiful green environment. So that's my recommendation. Go to Fitzroy Gardens.
All right. Definitely. And I'm sure there are many more places to visit.
So many more spaces, of course.
Yeah.
One of the world's most livable cities, so many spaces.
So Melbourne is an eco-city. It very much cares about its environment. And we often hear that, Melbourne has very clean air quality. And people don't really have to worry about suffering from, terrible air pollution, which many major cities do have to worry about and suffer. So I'd just like to ask you how Melbourne is dealing with climate change. How is it affecting Melbourne?
Yeah, I think you're exactly right in that we've been so lucky in what is a huge country. I mean, if you think about the size of Australia, it's as big as the lower 48 states of the US. So we have a really big landmass. We're a huge island, and so we've benefited from the fact that we've had relatively low population density and a huge land area. But again, I don't think that's something that we can rest on, particularly with diesel particulate matter. These sorts of air pollution issues are starting to creep a little bit, so we've got to take further action on that. Climate change, on the other hand, is having huge impacts on Australian cities. Urban heat, for example, we've mapped the entire city and we know exactly how hot each street is down to street level, and that's where technology is really, really important in making good policy decisions. But we know the central city is around 4 to 7 degrees Celsius hotter than the surrounding green areas. So that's where our urban forest strategy came about, where we want to double the forest canopy cover over the next 20 years, because we know that that'll cool the city by about 4 degrees. So each year we plant 3,000 trees, not just because they look good and not just because they really define what Melbourne's about, but they're really our first line of defence against things like urban heat and climate change.
But of course, something we all should be doing. So you're currently the chair of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute, MSSI. So I'd like to ask you, so what does MSSI do? And if you could tell us about research projects that are being carried out right now, especially regarding climate change, if you could tell us about that.
Yeah, it's a real privilege to be the chair of the Melbourne Sustainable Society Institute. They do amazing work, and what they are is an institute which sits over the top of all of the different faculties of the University of Melbourne, and their job is to bring together the humanities, the hard science, and really make that science accessible to people as well, so that it informs policy and outcomes. And they're looking into things like, what does climate change mean for food security. How do we feed a growing population, a rapidly growing population, when you also overlay climate change on top of that, which is, ruining many of those sort of stable crops that we used to rely on. So anything from climate impacts on water, what do we do with waste and recycling to reduce emissions through that? How do we get more sustainable transport? So that institute is really doing what I think is the work which needs to be taken notice of, again, if world cities want to be sustainable. And I think, again, something that Seoul does really well, something that Melbourne does really well, is that we're a true university town and we link with our university sector so that we get the best of academia, we combine that with good government policy, and then we want to drive on-ground outcomes as a result.
Could you also tell us about the Renewable Energy Project?
I can.
In detail, please. Yes,
I'm
I'd
very
love to hear
excited
about
about this one. This is, I think this is a really clear example where a local government or a metro government might sometimes think it's insignificant in terms of national policy and state policy, but local governments can have a huge impact on outcomes like renewable energy. The City of Melbourne doesn't have, we don't run the transport system, we don't run the education system, we don't run the electricity network, and we wanted to turn our electricity supply into renewable energy. So what we did is we got together a group of 13 other like-minded organisations. City of Melbourne led that process. Major corporates, things like the Melbourne Convention Exhibition Centre, University of Melbourne, RMIT, other local governments, and we put all our electricity together as a buying group, and we went out to market. And thankfully, we got a good tender, and that has built a wind farm in regional Victoria. So it's enough to power 17,600 households with renewable energy.
That's amazing.
And it means that City of Melbourne is 100% renewable energy for its entire operations load. And it's a really fantastic outcome and just shows the power of local governments bringing together different organisations, that we don't have to wait until national policy lines up. We don't have to wait until international policy lines up. You can just get on and get this done.
Right. So all places are basically powered by renewable energy. So this wind farm, how long did it take for it to be completed? It was completed this year, early this year?
It was completed in July this year. So as of January 1st this year, I call it our best New Year's Day present ever, was that we were, because they were building it in stages, that City of Melbourne was drawing 100% of its load in terms of renewable energy. So that's absolutely fantastic. I think in all it was about a year in construction, and I think again it's a great example of the relative prosperity of a capital city, big metro government using its prosperity to drive regional jobs. So about 240 jobs were created in the process. So I think this idea that going green or turning to renewables somehow means we lose something. But we actually gain so much. We gain new industries, new jobs, we gain cleaner air, and the running costs of a renewable energy generator are so much less than fossil fuels.
How many wind turbines are we talking about?
39 wind turbines. So I like to say that we built a wind farm, which is pretty cool.
What are maybe some of the types of renewable energy technologies you are working with right now and its objectives? Any additional information you can give us?
Yeah, look, again, I think this is something where we can really partner with Korea on, because that collaboration between countries is going to be really important when it comes to this big energy transition that we're in. And in Australia, people have voted with their hip pocket. So over 2 million households in Australia have a residential solar system on their roof. But some of the big leaps forward, I think, are going to come in thin film solar technology, where the windows in a skyscraper are literally generating electricity, or the roof tiles in your house are actually solar panels, and that's pretty exciting. But the other one that I think we'll really partner up with Korea on is green hydrogen. So that's hydrogen that comes from a large-scale solar system. So instead of the emissions that might get created in creating hydrogen from coal, you're getting this relatively emission-free hydrogen which can be used and transported all around the world as a fuel.
That's amazing. I actually considered installing solar panels.
You should do it.
But I've only been thinking about it for, I think, 2 years.
You can save money and save the environment at the same time.
I know. So you visited many places in Korea and explored many ways for improving intergovernmental cooperation. So as an expert in sustainability, any policies to suggest for improvement here in Korea?
Look, I think the thing for me is, Australia still has so much to learn as well. So, in meeting with the Seoul Metropolitan Government, in meeting with the various ministries here, in getting a chance to see up quite close the sort of industry and the advanced manufacturing that's going on, I think my biggest take home is that both countries have so much to win from an exchange. And I think the Korea relationship has been quite strong. We have a lot of students that exchange between the two countries.
Yes, yes.
And indeed, we're, I think, around the 4th or 5th in terms of bilateral trade. So there is really, really strong partnership between Korea and Australia, but I think more can be done. I think that Australia needs to focus even more on that relationship with Korea because, again, I think that the know-how and the knowledge and the sort of skills that Korea has combined with Australia could be quite powerful as we consider these new industries and things like the renewable energy revolution can be done better together.
We're going to take a quick break right here. We are joined today with Arron Wood, Deputy Lord Mayor of Melbourne, and we are going to take a look at a video clip of how he's been spending his days during his current visit in Korea. Let's take a look.
Today we meet with Arron Wood, who is about to look around Seoul.
So today's schedule is that we've been to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to hear about the diplomatic relations between North and South Korea and get an insight into some of those issues. And then we're going to get to go to the Seoul Metropolitan Government to hear more about their operations as well. And then we're going to get to do some sightseeing as well because, a bit of tourism is good for the country.
He has time to understand Seoul, the capital of Korea, stopping by the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to hear about foreign policies and walking around Seoul City Hall. Visiting Korea's cultural attractions, 청와대 사랑채 and the N Seoul Tower, he is drawn to charms of Seoul. How did Arron Wood find his day in Seoul?
Today was fantastic. I got to be a bit of a tourist as well as going to the Seoul Metropolitan Government and finding out how the city works. So I'm deeply impressed with Seoul's public transport system. I think the way that they're using smart city is very similar to Melbourne. And I think, if you want to be a really livable city, you have to be a smart city too. So to see the way that Seoul is using sort of the digital and the information technology components to monitor the city and then to make good policy based on that, I think has been really, really interesting.
Now let's shift our focus to KTK, which is Kids Teaching Kids, the program. Could you tell us what the program offers and how it's run?
Yeah,
I know you're very excited to talk about this.
I really get excited about this. I think that next generation of young people have not just so much to offer as future leaders, they're always told that, but young people can really change the dialogue and they can bring about really big action in their own right. So, I've always been really passionate about young people being involved in, having a say on their environmental future. So 20 years ago, which I can't believe, 20 years to the day almost, Kids Teaching Kids began and I started the program with my father, who was an elementary school principal at the time. So, yeah, I was working in waterway management and wondering how do we get the wider community involved in this conversation. And my father was wondering how to, really engender a much better school spirit, and, giving these kids a sense of place and linking to their natural environment. And that's been backed up by a lot of good research now. But what the kids do is they choose an environmental topic. It could be water, waste, energy, renewable energy, climate change. They have to research that topic in one of their semesters. And then at the end of that semester, they have to present a workshop to their peers. So, yeah, 140,000 students have been through the program over the last 20 years. I'm very proud of it.
That is amazing. So you've worked with so many kids, 140,000. The last time I read, I think I went to the webpage, it said 130,000. Now it's 140,000. Any, I guess, memorable moments, any memories working with these children over the 20 years? I mean, we're talking about a huge number of children.
Huge number of kids, but each of them, has an individual story. And I think probably for me, about 10,000 kids a year go through the program, and we get to a lot of the events to see them in action. I always learn something from a kids' workshop. It's not like they're just learning about sort of these really basic things. They're taking really complex, politically sensitive issues. They put them into the words that they understand. And sometimes out of a kid's mouth comes this thing where you just go, oh, wow. It sort of takes the blinkers off and you think, I just didn't think of it that way. But I think probably the thing that touches my heart and I get a bit emotional about is, when you see kids who aren't necessarily the elite high-flying kids and they go through this program where it's all about empowering them and giving them confidence, and they teach in teams, so 4 or 5 kids together. That child who may have just hung back and said, I can't do this, they're the one that you can't shut up at the end of it. That gives me a real sense of pride when you see them up there, talking about these environmental topics with such passion and such understanding. And you can just see the transformation, not only in their environmental understanding, but in the emergence of that confidence and that belief in themselves.
Yeah, I'm sure it's amazing to see these children. I mean, it doesn't really sound like you're giving them work to do. You're kind of giving them an opportunity to think about something and play with it and just learn about it. And eventually they're going to want to do something about it, do something to help, right? There's also Kids Teaching Kids Week, or there's also the Kids Conferences. Could you tell us a bit about that as well?
I can, because Kids Teaching Kids Week was literally last week. I finished Kids Teaching Kids Week and jumped on a plane and here I am. But Kids Teaching Kids Week is where they can implement the program in their school, so they can have a small event and they can invite other schools along. And what you see is a real sense of community start to build. So we have a lot of schools in big metro cities, but we have schools in tiny little towns in regional Australia, and that's absolutely fantastic. So you get a really different experience from city to city.
Sure. In your autobiography, it's called Billabong Boy. Okay, you talk about, of course, KTK and share stories of when you went through a difficult time, you struggled with depression. So how were you able to make it through those tough times? And could you also tell us about your autobiography?
Well, yes, it's called Billabong Boy, and that's because I grew up on a billabong, or what is a horseshoe lake in northwest Victoria on the beautiful Murray River. And the story is a hard one to think about and look back on, because I achieved a lot of things when I was young, and lots of awards and all of these accolades. And I found myself at about the age of 30 feeling really hollow, and that got worse to the point where I couldn't get myself out of bed, and I was diagnosed with depression and ended up on medication. And that kind of started another journey for me, where I wanted to find a way to cope. I was having crippling anxiety, and I got to the point where I just thought, I can't do my job anymore. It's so overwhelming. So I looked into all sorts of ways of making myself healthy, and for me, what I've learned is I need to rest. I need to go out and be physically active. And the other thing that I discovered, which I never thought that I'd get into, but meditation is a daily practice for me. So each morning I do my practice of meditation, and it's all of these things combined that just give me a better balance in life. But I think it was a really huge awakening to say that you're not invincible. You can't just keep going and going and going. If you drain that battery too much without recharging it, then eventually you'll come up against a pretty tough time. And I think the really sad thing is, in Australia and unfortunately a lot of countries, is that one of the biggest killers of men in particular between the age of 18 and sort of mid-30s is actually suicide. So this is a really serious issue. It has some really serious outcomes if it's not dealt with. And so my message to everyone is that if you're not good to yourself, you're no good to anyone. So look after yourself as much as you can.
Yes, as we all say, love yourself.
Yeah.
You need to love yourself. to be able to love anyone else. And I think people focus on their career way too much and rarely have time to kind of look back on themselves and give themselves the time to at least relax. But of course, yes. So now, Melbourne has a very diverse and multicultural population. Yeah, I think I even heard from someone that, Melbourne, if you go to Melbourne, you'll bump into, every single day, you'll bump into someone from a different country, and you'll even meet someone from a country you've never heard before.
Yes.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So that's how culturally diverse it is. Now, of course, Seoul is transforming into a multicultural city as well. Any advice for Seoul?
Look, again, I think I'm always, reluctant to give advice to another city because you've really got to operate in the context that you're operating in. But I think from a Melbourne perspective, one of the big things is to always be vigilant about that multiculturalism being a huge benefit and a huge contributor to the vibrancy of your city. There are too many commentators who want to create division and can look at things in a very simple lens, left, right, these sort of lenses. But multiculturalism and sort of social cohesion has a real depth to it. So it's not any one program, it's not any one action. At the end of the day, Melbourne's been judged as one of the world's most friendly cities as well. And I think just being kind and being friendly, these sorts of things are really important, and trying to understand each other. So I think, the Korea Foundation is doing a wonderful job in getting people to understand Korean culture, and I think these things really matter.
And we're down to our very final question. What are your plans as Deputy Mayor of Melbourne?
Oh, what are my plans? I think, we've got so much work ahead of us, with a really fast-growing population. We're the fastest-growing city in Australia, one of the fastest-growing in the OECD. That my real big focus is what keeps me up at night is, how do we provide enough open space? How do we make sure our city stays livable? How do we, support that cultural diversity to make Melbourne the great city it is? And then how do we combat some of these big challenges like climate change? So, there's plenty to do, that's for sure.
Well, I wish you the best with your future endeavors, and I'd like to thank you once again for sparing your time to join us on the show today.
Thank you. 감사합니다.
감사합니다. Leaders from around 190 countries have signed the Paris Agreement to counter global warming. Of course, even if we can't see the immediate success when it comes to the issues regarding climate change and global warming, our efforts to counter global warming should remain consistent and forward-looking. Thank you all for joining us today. I'll see you again next time.